Osmoregulation is the next system that we're going to look at. So osmo referring to water, and obviously regulation is this balance of water levels within the body. So obviously we know that we need to consume water in order to survive. We get our water through, obviously mostly through liquids, but also through foods as well. And there you go. Look, we can't live more than about 100 hours, which is about 4 days without water. So our bodies are very, very susceptible to dehydration, and we do suffer some quite serious consequences from that. Numbers are bandied around about the total water content, and generally it's considered to be roughly about, like 60% as a child, and then up to about 60% as well in adults, depending on gender and age. And it's interesting to note too that males actually have a higher water content than females do, mostly due to different amounts of body fat. So let's look at this picture over on the side, and we'll just look at some of the factors that the role that water plays in our bodies. So it's involved in regulating body temperature, allowing hypothalamus to detect changes in body temperature, lubricates the joints, the synovial joints, such as this shoulder joint here. It protects the organs. It's also a solvent for ions and organic molecules within our body. And kidney function. So that's a huge function, and we're going to talk about the kidney a lot when looking at osmoregulation. And there is this idea about flushing out toxins and things like that, which is a bit of a misnomer, but it is true that our kidneys obviously require, they do filter a huge amount of water every day, so it's a necessary substance for that. It also moistens food, which means that it's easier for us to swallow, and it forms the bolus of the food. And finally, these mucosal tissues that we have, in particular the mouth, nose, and also eyes, which are not mucosal tissue, but it's very important that these tissues are kept moist through the process of taking in water. This diagram over on the side of the page is, it's a big diagram, and it does show you the general ideas about how our bodies feed back negatively in order to get our water levels balanced. And we'll go through it quickly. I do want to point out that there's a whole lot of information over here talking about renin, which is a hormone, and angiotensin 2 is also a hormone. We're going to look at them in a little bit of detail, but these are two hormones, angiotensin 2 and also renin, which are also involved in regulating blood pressure. So by regulating blood pressure, they have a side effect of feeding back into the amount of water that is contained within our blood. But we're not going to spend a huge amount of time looking at these. This is kind of like an indirect control of water balance in our bodies. We are going to focus on a couple of other hormones that we'll get to a little bit later. Okay, so this sort of focuses on dehydration, which is obviously an imbalance from the normal state. So dehydration meaning that we've lost water. So dehydration, as well as feeding into the system of hormones that regulates blood pressure, it also feeds into this control center in this, which is the hypothalamus. But within the hypothalamus, there are these nerve receptors called osmoreceptors. So the hypothalamus in this case is not only the control center, but it is actually the detector that is responding to changes in the blood pressure. So we know that blood pressure decreases when we have less water within our blood, and that it just makes sense. If there is less of a volume in a fixed area, then the blood pressure or the pressure of that volume of that liquid will decrease. The other thing that happens in dehydration is saliva decreases, and it dries out our mouth and our throat, and that tends to feed more into a behavioural response to counteracting dehydration. So all of these three aspects feed into the hypothalamus, although we know up here that the hypothalamus is also a detector as well as a control centre. The control centre, what we call the thirst centre in the hypothalamus, is activated, it's stimulated. This increases our thirst. This makes us want to consume fluid. We go and we drink fluid. it will increase our fluid intake, and therefore it will increase the water levels, and the dehydration is lessened. This negatively feeds back into the system, and this, when it runs through this system the second time, these factors may not be picked up anymore. Over this side of the slide, it just goes through general ideas about water needs. So it's interesting to note that men actually need more water than women do, due to generally having a lower fat content in their bodies. They also tend to expend more energy than women do, so that requires more water as well. Infants and young children are really susceptible to dehydration. They are not very good at concentrating their urine, and so what that means is that they tend to excrete more water than an adult would. And so what that means is that it's really important to make sure that infants and young children are really well hydrated. They need to have a lot of fluids, especially in warm temperatures, warm environments. Also interesting that infants actually have a greater surface area relative to their weight, and so any moisture that they are losing from their skin is actually greater than what it would be proportionally for an adult. So this slide is detailing just where all of this liquid is within our body. So we know that we have fluid inside our cells and we have fluid outside our cells, but exactly where are they found? So generally our body tends to be about 60% made up of fluids, and within that, 2/3 of that, or 66%, is found within cells or intracellular, and 1/3 of that is found outside of our cells. So between every cell there is this layer of fluid that kind of bathes all our cells within that. This also includes plasma down here. So the plasma is the liquid component of our blood. So the blood actually is only about 20% of the entire volume of water or liquid that is contained within our body. A larger proportion of that is the interstitial fluid, which we'll talk about over here, but it's basically the fluid that is between the cells. Okay, so over here, as we said, the intracellular, or in the fluid that's inside the cells, is the 2/3 part of that. Extracellular is intravascular, so that's another word that refers to plasma down here. So intravascular, within veins or within blood vessels, meaning blood, and also extravascular, so fluid that is found outside vascular vessels, so outside of the blood vessels within our body. The take-home idea from this is simply that our bodies have a huge amount of liquid in them, and we're very susceptible to changes in water within our cells and within our bodies. So this is why this needs to be so highly regulated. So we have a lovely, not so lovely, picture of a real kidney over here, and the kidneys are going to be the major organ involved in filtering our blood and producing urine. So in other words, in regulating how much water is found in our body and how much water we excrete. It's very interesting to note that every day our kidneys are filtering about 180 litres of plasma. That's a huge amount of plasma. Now obviously we do not have 180 litres of plasma in our blood, but what this is saying is that every litre of blood makes several return trips through the kidney. So the kidneys are constantly filtering, and all of our blood will pass through the kidneys at least once during the day. Most of this water is actually reabsorbed, and so the urine output generally tends to be only about 1 to 1.5 litres. So that's a tiny proportion of how much plasma is being filtered, and therefore it just shows you the importance of the kidneys. Really, really important in terms of filtering our blood, but also returning most of this water back into our bodies. So the way that they do this, we'll talk about this shortly in a couple of slides, but basically the kidneys are able to adjust the content of the urine that comes out. So the kidneys can make urine very dilute, so have a really high water content in relation to how many solutes are there, or alternatively they can make the urine very concentrated if our bodies are wanting to retain water, and we'll talk about that soon. As you get older, the ability of your kidneys to concentrate urine actually improves, and we talked about this previously. And so what this means is that young children, as we said, the urine tends to be very dilute, and so they end up secreting an awful lot of water that as an adult their body might have hung on to. You can see with the picture of the kidney over here that there's a set of arteries and veins that enter and leave. So this is where the blood through the renal artery will enter the kidney, and then through the renal vein it returns out. The ureter is the tube that actually carries the urine from the kidney down to the bladder, and we'll look at that in a bit more detail soon. So this is the structure of the kidney. This part here is kind of like the kidney has been chopped in half lengthways, so we're kind of looking at the inside of the kidney. You may have even noticed this if you happen to eat kidneys. So for example, you might have a grandmother. Grandmothers tend to like steak and kidney pie and things like that. And often what you notice is that it has this kind of striated appearance, or it's this sort of regular arrangement of the cellular components within it that give it a stripy kind of appearance. Every single one of these little stripy bits is actually it's one functional unit called the nephron, and we're going to look at more detail about what the nephrons actually do. But the entire kidney is made up of these nephrons. We're keeping the structure of the kidney quite simple. So you can actually see that there are a couple of different layers. There is the cortex, which is around the outside, and the medulla, which is the region in the centre. Don't stress about that too much. Really, our focus is going to be just on the function of the nephron, so we're going to look at that in more detail. There is also this collecting space in the centre, which is where the urine actually collects. This is called the renal pelvis. Don't worry about this word, it's really not that important. But basically it's where the urine leads from that place out to the ureters and then out to the bladder, where it will then exit the body. There are a huge number of nephrons within each kidney, and we're going to look at that structure in more detail now. So this is a schematic diagram of just one nephron. It's actually much more complicated than this, and there are a couple of regions, this one here and this one here, which actually tend to be quite convoluted and tangled, and they've been drawn here as sort of a nice, easy, simple line, but these tubules are actually quite complex. Just keep that in mind as we go through. So generally what happens up here, you've got your blood coming in, and this region of very fine capillaries is called the glomerulus. Always get that one wrong. And this is kind of like, it looks like a ball basically of capillaries, and this is going to be where the initial filtration of blood occurs. Okay, blood coming into the kidney is under extremely high pressure, and the reason for that is that it's come from reasonably large arteries feeding into it, and then the size of these arteries or arterioles actually decreases quite rapidly to about half of the width. And by doing so, it greatly increases the blood pressure that comes through. One of the reasons that our heart has to generate a blood pressure is mostly due to the ability of being able to push blood through the kidney, because it's much more difficult to push blood through the kidneys here. So wrapped around this capillary bed, or this ball of capillaries, is the first tube. And this is actually called the Bowman's capsule, and this wraps around this glomerulus, which is the capillary bed here. So the filtrate, which is basically made up of water and glucose, and most of the salts are pushed through under an extremely high pressure. Pretty much all of it is pushed through directly into Bowman's capsule. This capsule is then linked into this tube that will carry these substances through the rest into the collecting duct, and the collecting duct then leads off into the ureters, which will go down to the bladder. Okay, but before it gets down here, there's a few different things that have to happen. We'll go over this in more detail on the next slide, but basically as this liquid and salt and glucose passes down this tube here, a lot of that is reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. So you can see here that there is the blood vessels running down and coming back up. This whole loopy bit has a name that is called the loop of Henle. and this is where the all of these sort of tubes run down, but the capillaries run down with them as well. There is a special thing about these capillaries, and we'll talk about that in a second, but it's this concept that we kind of have a countercurrent flow, which becomes quite useful. Okay, so all the fluid passes down here. A lot of it is reabsorbed, coming down here. It travels back up, and then we'll come back down here through the collecting duct. The collecting duct is the last part before the urine is passed on to the ureters, and this is the last chance that the kidneys have to reabsorb a lot of the water that has not already been absorbed so far. And we'll talk about this more on the next slide. So this is a more simplified version of a nephron, which is that sort of unit of the kidney. You can see up here that we have this glomerulus, which is this ball of capillaries surrounded by Bowman's capsule, which is the first tube-like part in the kidney that surrounds it. These blue arrows are showing the direction of the fluid through the nephron, so down through the loop of Henle, back up, and then back down into the collecting duct. You might come across some of these words, proximal tubule. So proximal means close to the beginning, and so this part here is the proximal tubule. This part distal. Distal means kind of like distant or far away, and so this is the distal tubule, the far away part from where the glomerulus was in the first place. Okay, so just to make things a little bit simpler, in this part, just make that arrow a bit smaller. So in this part where the glomerulus is, pretty much everything is filtered in that direction. So there we go. So everything is filtered here because it is under such high pressure. Water, glucose, salts, and urea are all pushed from the blood into the Bowman's capsule. And as it passes down through the proximal tubule, so this is down in this region here. Make that a little bit smaller. So as the fluid passes down through here, in fact this little arrow should be pointing up here into the proximal tubule, sorry. So all the glucose, most of the sodium, and most of the water is actually reabsorbed at this stage. So as we said previously, a huge amount of the liquid that passes through the nephron is actually reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. This is good because otherwise we would be getting rid of all of these good things that our body has taken in. So we need to have a system of reabsorption. So the liquid continues to pass down, goes down through the loop of Henle and then up into the distal tubule and finally comes down into the collecting duct. And this is where, let's make it a bit smaller, oops. So it is actually in the collecting duct where variable amounts of water are reabsorbed back into the blood. So the collecting duct, this last part of the nephron, is kind of where the control comes over how much water is reabsorbed or not reabsorbed, and that will determine how concentrated the urine is. And this part depends on whether you are already dehydrated or whether you are overhydrated, so you have too much liquid in your body. This happens through a series of these little pores in the collecting duct, which are called aquaporins. So aqua meaning water, porins meaning holes. And these aquaporins are controlled by a hormone that we will look at in a moment. And that controls basically how much water is going to re-enter the bloodstream or will alternatively stay in the collecting duct. So this slide is just mentioning this concept that the blood pressure that is pushing the blood into the nephron is quite important, and it needs to be very high in order to allow all of this filtration to occur. But if the blood pressure is falling, it means that the filtration rate will decrease also, and that makes sense because if you've got less pressure pushing the blood through, it's going to take longer to be able to filter that. However, the process is really precisely regulated. It's so important that the kidney pressure stays the same, that even though you might be getting changes or fluctuations in pressure in your arteries in your body, the filtration rate through the kidneys generally stays pretty constant per day. Just noting down here that after you initially get this filtrate being formed, there is a lot of this reabsorption that occurs, and we just talked about that previously. And this reabsorption, the amount of reabsorption of water depends upon what your body actually needs. Does it need to absorb more water, or does it need to get rid of more water? These next two slides are going to go over basically the crux of the whole osmoregulation, and basically looking at exactly how the kidneys and the body works together to control urine output, because by controlling both the quantity of urine that is output as well as the quality of it in terms of what it's actually made up of, that determines how much water is then retained by the body or excreted. There are two hormones that are involved in this process, and we're actually going to look at them in a bit more detail on the next screen. But just introducing their names to you, aldosterone is one of the hormones, and this is produced by, they've said here, adrenal cortex. It's really just part of the adrenal gland. So remembering that the adrenal glands are situated directly above the kidneys. Obviously, that's a very handy place for that gland to be, given that the action of aldosterone will be on the kidney itself. The second hormone is called ADH, and we'll talk about that on the next screen where we've got the full name written out. So just before we go over onto the next slide, basically this is just emphasising that depending on what we eat and drink, and depending on the sort of the salt and also the water content of what we take in food and drink, as well as the type of environmental conditions we're exposed to. So for example, in much hotter temperatures, we're more likely to lose water, and therefore our body will want to retain more water rather than excreting it. But the urine that is output is in response to this blood volume and the composition of the blood as well. And that does change over the course of a day, and also in the course of different environmental conditions that we'll be placed in, and therefore the urine output actually changes accordingly. So basically the kidneys, which are found towards the back, most healthy people have two of them, but you can survive with just one kidney. Actually, while we're on this is a very nice diagram showing the two kidneys at the back, and these little tubes that feed down into the bladder, which is down here, these are called the ureters, so ureter, and these are these very, very thin tubes that run from the kidneys down to the bladder, and they are the tubes that carry the urine from the kidney to the bladder. And then from the bladder to the outside of the body, it's through the urethra, which is uretra. So that's the urethra that goes to the outside of the body. So just to give you sort of an overview of that terminology that's involved there. But basically, the kidneys are there to regulate the blood volume, and they do that, as we've talked about previously, by controlling how much water is reabsorbed back into them, and that will therefore change the dilution of the blood, or change how much water volume is in the blood. So this is just the second part of the screen, of the slide, and it's just emphasising these two hormones that are involved. So aldosterone was this one here that we talked about previously. This is a hormone that is, it's kind of indirectly involved in water balance, and that is because it directly controls electrolyte concentration. So if you think back to last year, and we talked about osmosis of water going from a high concentration of water to a low concentration of water, often that was driven by by the salt content within those cells, or the salt content of two solutions. And so in this case, aldosterone controls how much salt is found in a particular place, and as an effect of how much salt is found, that will either draw water towards it or sort of take water away from it. And we'll talk about this in a bit more detail shortly. The second hormone that we touched on before, which is ADH, the ADH stands for anti, it's the A, diuretic, which is the D, and hormone, anti-diuretic hormone. So you may or may not be familiar with that word diuretic. And we actually drink an awful lot of diuretic drinks. So diuretic drinks are things like coffee and Coca-Cola. Basically anything that has caffeine in it is considered to be a diuretic. And a diuretic is something that makes you pee a lot. So if you drink coffee or Coke, you might find that you need to go to the toilet a lot, and that's because it is flushing all the fluids out of your body. So obviously, something that is an anti-diuretic will be something that is acting against that. So rather than flushing water out of your system, the anti-diuretic hormone acts to retain water within your body. Okay, so let's look at exactly how ADH does this. ADH, remember what it stands for? Have a think. Anti-diuretic hormone. Anti-diuretic hormone is the main hormone that we're going to concentrate on. Now, we've touched on a few different hormones previously, like aldosterone, and if you remember back a few slides ago, we also talked about angiotensin 2. And these other hormones are also intricately involved in the system, but as you are getting a sense of how these things are linked together, it can become very, very complex. And so what we're going to do just at this year, the year 13 level, is we're just going to concentrate on this one hormone called ADH, but don't forget about aldosterone, and we'll come back to that shortly. Okay, so let's have a look at ADH. So basically, what is the receptor? So remember, we've got to think about receptor of the system, the control center, and then the effector. So inside the hypothalamus, and remember the hypothalamus is this little tiny triangular area just inside the brain here, as well as being a control center that we know, it also has these little receptors called osmoreceptors that are found inside the hypothalamus, and they are able to detect changes with the plasma volume. So in this case, these osmoreceptors are hanging out and they are looking for a fall in the plasma volume or a decrease in that plasma volume. Remember that plasma is the liquid component of blood. So when they detect this change, when they detect this decrease in the plasma volume, they stimulate those cells, those neurosecretory cells that are found also in the hypothalamus. My goodness, the hypothalamus is a multi-talented part of your body, isn't it? And so these neurosecretory cells can synthesize or make and also secrete this hormone, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so ADH then travels from the hypothalamus, and this goes down to the posterior pituitary. Now remember, the pituitary gland is this little gland just down here, just below the hypothalamus. And this is actually where it is released back into the bloodstream. So the hypothalamus is they're really nerve cells, and so it needs to link back into a endocrine gland, like the pituitary, to sort of translate that message from being a nerve message into a hormonal message. ADH, when it is released into the blood, actually acts on the kidney itself. And what it does is, if you remember back to that collecting duct, which was the last part of the duct in that nephron, it increases the permeability of it. And so, in other words, it actually increases these tiny little holes that are found within it. We've touched on that before. They're called aquaporins. And so when the aquaporins are opened up or increased, more water is therefore able to pass through from the collecting duct back into the bloodstream, back into the nephron, and therefore it's more water is reabsorbed and the urine volume is going to decrease. Osmoregulation is a little bit different to what we have looked at previously in thermoregulation, in that there are not really two opposing mechanisms involved to either increase or decrease or act against those changes. And instead what we're looking at is, because we're concentrating on antidiuretic hormone, we can think about this in terms of whether ADH is released and therefore has an effect, or whether ADH, the release of it is inhibited or stopped, and therefore no ADH acts. So rather than talking about two separate systems opposing each other, we just talk about presence of ADH release and also absence of ADH release. So this slide is going through just some ideas about what can cause ADH to be released or inhibited, and what the outcome of that is. So that's the key point here. There is nothing acting against ADH. We are just either releasing it or we're inhibiting the release. So things that might stop it from being produced and released are things like a low solute concentration. So in other words, if your blood is quite dilute, if there's a lot of plasma around, so that's why it's talking here about high blood volume, low blood sodium levels, and that's really pretty much the same as the low solute concentration, high fluid intake. So if you have just consumed an awful lot of liquid, that will translate into an increased blood volume, and so that means that you don't need to be retaining water, and therefore ADH will not be released. Alcohol consumption as well can also inhibit ADH release. So all of these factors mean that ADH is not released. Remember, ADH is antidiuretic hormone. It is a hormone that causes retention of water, and therefore the water reabsorption will decrease and your urine output will increase. Okay, so no ADH. That means that no water will be retained, and therefore the urine output will increase overall. Okay, so the opposite to that is factors that cause ADH to be released. So this could be a high solute concentration, which could be the same as high sodium levels. So in other words, you have a high concentration of your blood and low levels of water in there, or low comparative levels of water. It could also be that you've actually just got a low blood volume generally, so that's what these receptors are picking up on too. Low fluid intake, so it might be that you're becoming a little bit dehydrated or a bit thirsty. And there's a couple of other things here too, like nicotine and morphine can cause ADH to be released also. So ADH, antidiuretic hormone, means that you retain water. So down here you are reabsorbing more water, and therefore the urine output will decrease. So just a quick review of these ideas, focusing on things like the stimulus, the receptors, the control center, and the effectors as well. So stimulus in this case is going to be the increase or decrease of water in the blood plasma. Now remember that this is we're just talking about ADH, and so an increase or a decrease will cause either the release or the non-release of ADH. Receptors are found in the hypothalamus, and they are sensitive to these changes in plasma water concentration. So the receptors are in the hypothalamus, as well as the control center being the hypothalamus. Okay. However, the pituitary gland, in particular the posterior pituitary, can also be considered to be part of the control center. Okay, and as well as being the control center, it's also the effector. So the effector is the release, the stimulation and release of this antidiuretic hormone. And as we know, the antidiuretic hormone goes on to have an effect directly on the kidney, the collecting duct in the kidney. So this is just kind of emphasizing just how insanely important the hypothalamus is. So look, hypothalamus, detecting changes. So it's detecting the change in the stimulus, which is the water plasma, water within the plasma. Hypothalamus, along with the posterior pituitary, is the control center as well. And as well as being the control center, it also allows the release of antidiuretic hormone, and then this has an effect on the collecting duct in the kidney itself. So just to run through this summary just one more time, because you haven't seen it enough times yet, a couple of ideas about what happens in different situations. So what happens when you're dehydrated, what happens when you're overhydrated. So this is dehydration first. In this case, we're talking about water levels in the plasma falling. This allows the osmoreceptors, which are within the hypothalamus, to detect this change. They send a signal to the pituitary gland, in particular the posterior pituitary. So ADH is produced in the hypothalamus, and then it's actually stored in the posterior pituitary, and from the pituitary gland it is released into the blood. This ADH then travels down to the kidneys through the bloodstream. So it travels in particular to the collecting tubules, which, as we remember, is down here. So this is the last part of this nephron, and that's the target tissue. So do you remember way back at the beginning when we were talking about how these hormones had really, really specific cells that they acted on? So in this case, the collecting duct, that is the target tissue. So those cells will be the ones that have those very specific cell surface receptors on them, and they will respond to the presence of ADH, whereas the rest of the nephron does not contain those cell surface receptors, and so it will not respond. Okay, so ADH targets the collecting duct, and when it gets there, it actually causes these aquaporins. Remember, aquaporin is water pores or water holes, and you can sort of see the influence of them down here. Causes them to open. Therefore, you're going to get an increase of water coming from the collecting duct back into the blood. And we haven't drawn the capillaries on here, but remember from those first slides that the capillaries actually follow the collecting duct, in fact all of the nephron around, and when the water is shown to be moving between things, it moves from the collecting duct into the bloodstream. So if you're getting water leaving the collecting duct, you can see sort of a gradual process here where the solutes are less concentrated up here as there is more water, and as it travels down and more water leaves, at the very bottom of the collecting duct you can now see that those solutes, or that waste product that is going to be secreted, is now at a much higher concentration. And so what that means is that the urine that is excreted is going to be very concentrated, and there's also going to be a small volume of it. So on a less pleasant note, you might experience this if you're dehydrated, that often your urine can turn quite a dark colour, as well as reducing in the quantity of it. This is a bit more of a detailed picture showing exactly what happens with these aquaporins. There is a lot of information on this slide, and there's a couple of sort of, I would suggest they are kind of extension pieces of information. So things like talking about the countercurrent system. I'll touch on that, but it's not really necessary for your knowledge at this level, okay? So this diagram here is kind of like taking a snapshot through the collecting duct. So it's through this one here, this red circle part, and the duct here, this is the collecting duct. So the red arrow is showing you that is the movement of the contents of the collecting duct traveling down. And what we don't show you in the other diagrams, but what is always there, is a capillary directly adjacent to the duct. And so what this means is that whenever you get the movement of water out of the duct, it's not just going into random kidney tissue, it will be transferring from the duct into the capillary, okay? These little green things, they kind of look like equal signs, but what they are, these are the aquaporins, okay? And so what happens is that ADH, antidiuretic hormone, has come along. It is activating or opening up these aquaporins, and when these aquaporins open, it just makes this duct more permeable because it's pretty much just making more holes in it, and so the water is going to flow from the duct into the capillary, okay? Now the countercurrent system, you may remember this back when we were talking about in the fish gas exchange system with the gills, and the fact that the countercurrent system is there to promote diffusion, and it makes diffusion much more effective. So this is this example in us where we have a countercurrent system. So because the fluid in the duct is flowing in an opposite direction to the blood in the capillary, what that means is that it maintains a favorable concentration gradient. And so it means that the movement of water to the capillary, so from the duct to the capillary, is going to be much more effective than if both of these were flowing in the same direction. And the very last slide, so this just comes back and it talks about what happens when you are overhydrated. So in other words, if you have too much liquid in your body. So instead of producing some other different kind of hormone, we are going to concentrate on the idea that ADH is inhibited, or no ADH is being produced. So if no ADH is produced, it cannot travel down to the collecting duct. It cannot open the aquaporins, so they will remain closed. That's like their baseline state. No water or very little water will be reabsorbed from the collecting tubules. And so what happens is that, unlike previously in a dehydrated situation, we are not reabsorbing this water. And so the urine that is produced will be quite dilute because a lot of water is being excreted. And it's also going to be a much larger volume because we're not retaining that water for use. So just to recap quickly, ADH is the main hormone that we are looking at in terms of osmoregulation, but remember that aldosterone does also play a role. It does this indirectly because aldosterone controls the electrolyte or the salt, sort of the salt concentration of our blood, and therefore it can control how much water comes in indirectly. There is also the other two hormones that we mentioned at the beginning, and for example, angiotensin 2, but those are the hormones that are involved more directly in controlling blood pressure. But they do play a role in osmoregulation as well. So they may be ones that you want to go off and do a little bit further research on. But as far as everything you need to know, ADH is really it. So that's the main hormone that you could concentrate on.